Being an entrepreneur has become like a sexy sort of thing. It's like people go to school and like, man, my goal is to be a VC. And I'm like, what? Why? What? Really? Like, why? Do you actually know what that entails? Like, I get like, it feels good to be a VC sometimes. Like you have all these people pitching you and asking for money.
One thing we look for in talent is sort of hybrid people who combine very rare skill sets together that make them truly one of one. And I mentioned kind of this point of unrelated. I think it's a really important point to make of like sometimes like peripherally unrelated talents that are actually very valuable.
When you are trying to pitch let's say an LP to get funding for SignalFire, or you're pitching an entrepreneur because you really want to invest in their fund, or someone you're looking to hire, how much prep work do you do about them so you come into the meeting?
Sometimes it can be tricky to diagnose exactly what the root cause is, right? So it could be, to your point, something in kind of the feedback loop that the founders have built, or it could be something structural in the business itself.
So welcome to the next episode of the Entrepreneurial Excellence podcast interview series. I'm super excited to have Wayne Hu here. He is a general partner at SignalFire. He's been there a long time, really helped build them up into one of the preeminent venture capital firms in the United States. And we'd certainly love to talk about that whole journey you've gone through there, Wayne itself. But I first even want to say part of why I feel so lucky to have Wayne here is not only because he's just so impressive in his background and just how smart Wayne is, but also I was so flattered when I first met you because you actually reached out, right? So a big name general partner reached out to little me and basically said, I would love to learn more about your investing style because you've made some really impressive investments. And you're on the board of one of those investments, and just reached out to chat, which once again, truly, like, I was so flattered by that because I do my investing stuff on the side for fun. It's my way of sort of giving back to the community, but of course, hopefully making a great return as well. Not for notoriety or anything else. Then to have it be noticed by someone of your stature was truly flattering. So first off, thank you for that. But second of all, tell everybody a little bit more about your background, SignalFire, and that sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for this super kind introduction. I have to say, I was originally flattered you would take the introduction. As somebody who's like running a company and super busy yourself. And to be honest, like I did it because I was impressed you were in the company before me, and if you could do that, I wanted to know like what process kind of led you to such an amazing. Of course, both mutual fans of Even Up. You've done incredibly well. So. Kudos to you. So in my journey, I've always been fascinated by the intersection of venture capital and data. I actually wrote my college thesis on the topic almost 20 years ago, when the industry was like 10 times smaller, and maybe only a few people would be hired into venture every year, and certainly not like an outsider.
It wasn't even sexy. It wasn't even sexy back then. I mean, like, I will say one thing we'll probably talk more about, but is like venture capital. Being an entrepreneur has become like a sexy sort of thing. It's like people go to school and like, man, my goal is to be a VC. And I'm like, what? Why? What? Really? Like, why? Do you actually know what that entails? Like, I get like, it feels good to be a VC sometimes. Like you have all these people pitching you and asking for money, but what made you like, why all the way back then when that was so new, was that a thing that you were considering or thinking about?
To me, my parents are kind of blue collar, but then they studied, engineering at community college, and then became sort of IT operators, and then kind of worked their way up to becoming software engineers. So for me, there was something that I associated kind of startups and engineering with kind of intergenerational social mobility, sort of like this concept of making a better life, the American dream. So Silicon Valley always kind of had like this aura kind of in my head.
Was that but you didn't grow up in Silicon Valley, right? You grew up in the middle of the country.
Yeah. I grew up in Minnesota, so I really didn't know anything about startups and venture capital. But I did, in the course of just like reading a random article, at the time, there's a lot of articles that sort of, it's maybe more so back then, kind of lionized venture capitalists as sort of these kingmakers.
Yeah, they're like, I'm gonna go pick you, and you're gonna become this multi-billion-dollar world-changing company. Like you've been anointed by the king.
Yeah, exactly. And so I guess that probably sparked my interest in it. I had no capacity to actually break into the industry, so it took me kind of like many years later before I kind of found my way to the wonderful team at Klein & Perkins. That was kind of a journey in itself. But I could say venture was certainly, to your point, not what I expected at all. And I actually left Kleiner being very grateful for the opportunity, but thinking it wasn't for me. I kind of had one of these canonical venture experiences where, I was given an office and desk and kind of it was like, let us know when you found something.
But how do I know if I found something? There's a million entrepreneurs out there with ideas.
Yeah, and
how do I know?
And that's like not to rag on the team at Kleiner at all. That's just like traditional venture, like how it kind of works. It's like very much a lone wolf experience. Yep. And and I wasn't really used to an environment where you're kind of capitated on what you can do by without kind of the leverage of technology or a team, right? And so in that environment, my strategy was actually to use data to try to give myself an edge. And I was analyzing company information like hiring rates, trying to predict company revenue, what can I infer about company lifecycle by what kinds of hires they're making, that sort of thing, to kind of prioritize like what targets I should go after. And so naturally, I was really predisposed to a different way of doing venture as kind of like an outsider. Yep. And when I got to the call from Chris Farmer, who started SignalFire, he shared this vision of structuring an entire company, like a tech company end to end, directly to kind of solve this scaling issue that I saw in venture in scaling founder value add, and many kind of like the rote manual associate workflow as well. So that was 9 years ago. Happy to kind of go into more of the thesis.
Yeah, I mean, how do you? I have a bunch of questions. I mean, like first, just talk about Chris really briefly. Why do you think he identified you as someone even who was a different sort of VC and thinker? Like, were you publishing stuff? Like, how did he know you were someone to call?
Yeah. Chris has a thesis that the best people for the job are the ones who kind of like raise their hand, through their actions before. Yep. And he was looking for somebody who kind of had a kind of the intersection of, at the time, it was obviously someone from sort of like the data background, somebody who had worked at startups before, somebody who had some venture experience, and he was also looking for somebody who had some consulting experience because at the time, SignalFire did start as a company, right? And we actually had a book of business and a book of clients, and he was looking for somebody who could sort of help manage the portfolio of customers as he kind of focused more on raising the first fund. And it turns out 10 years ago, if you look for the intersection of those things, it was a pretty short list, thankfully.
And what do you think about, I mean, this will maybe go into just being a venture investor in general, but also how important is the ability to pick talent towards the meaning to build a great company in general, right? So like, let's pretend that SignalFire, I mean, it was a company, I kind of would view it as a company. Yes, it's a venture capital firm, but like it's a business, right? And it scaled from, I don't know what your first fund was to billions of dollars now under management. Like, what are those qualities you even saw with Chris where you're like, this is a guy who knows how to build, who's a great entrepreneur and knows how to build and pick talent, picking you as one of those talented people, to not overstate your qualities, but I mean, like, what are the things you think you saw or learned from him around picking talent?
Yeah. I would say that is, if I had to pick one superpower for Chris, it's a talent. And he actually spent, his background is very much as like a talent scout. One of his first entrepreneurial startups was as sort of like a tech-enabled recruiting firm. Yep. And the whole notion was to like use referral networks kind of at scale, digitize them, and figure out kind of like who the best talent was. This kind of like predates is like SignalFire, like I guess version 1.0 in some ways. I think there's a few things that he taught me to look for, which I think translates onto the founder side. One was how to kind of screen for raw horsepower, right? In this industry, you have to ramp up this sort of infinite learning curve across many different very oftentimes like unrelated industries. From like you could be taking a meeting in like a quantum computer company and like a consumer social app the next minute, and as a proxy, he looked for people who has excellence in sort of unrelated fields. Yeah. So, for example, YY on our team is like I think she's like a 6-time Canadian national chess champion, but then also like this crazy quant from Blackstone kind of thing. So a lot of like demonstrated excellence, and he's hired a lot of like Olympic level athletes like in the past. People who figure out kind of how to just get really good. New at something. And so I think that's one thing that he showed me sort of how high the bar could be there. Yeah. He's also got a really good eye for people who are talent magnets themselves. This is actually something I feel like it probably doesn't pertain to like something I could work on more, but he's found a lot of people at SignalFire and a lot of the founders he backed who are just who have sort of this level of charisma and magnetism that just gets amazing people, especially technical talent, to get to want to work with them. And I think he has a really strong eye for that sort of that skill in particular.
Why do you think you're not able to like replicate that, or why is it hard for a founder to maybe replicate that sort of work, like the sort of talent magnet work?
Yeah, I think I think there's a few there's probably a few things that go into it. One is there's a little level of just sort of inherent magnetism. You want to be kind of the person that people want to follow. There's certainly a level of I think won't take no for an answer. Persistence. Like I think a lot of it. Chris is an unbelievable closer. When it comes to deals and hiring and so forth. And I think that the kinds of people he tends to back have similar characteristics. They're just sort of relentless and dogged in the pursuit of making sure, like
Is that doggedness? I mean, does that come out in emails, phone calls, inviting people to dinner, just making them really feel like there's like the love, like he wants you to be on his team? Is that the action?
Yeah, it's outcome. All of the above. It's kind of like going the extra mile, like all sorts of things. Like you have if you have a general idea of where someone's living, like texting them and saying, like, hey, I just happen to be in the area or whatever, and be like, oh, really? I live above like XYZ bar, and Chris would be the kind of person to be like, I'm at that bar right now, and then like hop in the car and go there, and meet them and close them till like not leave until they sign, at midnight kind of thing. He's got that level of persistence.
In do you then, I mean, so a few questions then, right? So one is, I mean, it sounds like then there's sort of two key parts to sort of talent identification. And maybe this goes into what's going to be a great entrepreneur as well, but is like one part is you got to identify the person. But okay, so fine, like I can identify people, and I want to talk maybe more about that too, right? Like, there's thousands of former Olympians out there. He's still only choosing 1% of them who he might want to go after. So it's sort of a question, but we'll come back to that too, which is like, but then so that's one part. Part two, it sounds like, is this ability to sell people on the why. In define that a little bit more, right? Okay, he's dogged, great. But if you're dogged and you can't tell a story, it probably doesn't matter. So clearly he's got a skill set on that front too.
Oh yeah, he's a masterful storyteller, that's for sure. He, we like to joke whenever we get in meetings with him. It's like success if you can interject like 2 points over the course of an hour meeting. He's just like I would say the style of storytelling he has is it's kind of like mad scientist, where his domain is venture. Like he studied every single permutation of venture capital back to like its origins. He worked at Bessemer back in the day, which I think is like I think it's the oldest, the oldest, like 100-year-old, venture fund with kind of like all of the longitudinal data. He knows every single fund out there. He studied like their specific model. He's interviewed at one point. He actually wrote, I think, an HBR article where he had interviewed something like hundreds of people within the venture ecosystem on like, what is your strategy? What's your differentiation? How do you generate returns and so forth? So
should people look that up? It sounds like it's probably still, I would assume, still relevant to like learn from that.
Yeah.
Who wants to get
into that. Yeah. It was one of the defining articles on kind of on like back in the day on ranking. It got some press on ranking kind of venture funds. Using it's kind of like a similar concept as PageRank, which is like there's network proximity, to talent nodes and what have you. So this is something he's been studying forever, and like when I first joined, he was, like 9 p.m. on a Tuesday. We're just like, both working away. He would just stop what he's doing and he would like map out the entire venture ecosystem for me for no reason. He'd just be like, here's the matrix of how I think about the venture landscape. These are different stages. These are different like, types of archetypes of firms. Here are the different players. Here are the things to lead. He just kind of like mapped out everything in his mind before he kind of chose this model. And I think, I think it comes across in his storytelling that he, is certainly something that we look for in founders as well, is the ability to kind of like go, 5 layers deep. He definitely has that.
But is it also, is it not only going 5 layers deep, but also the ability to summarize in a concise way. Like I'm sure he can give you a fantastic like elevator pitch on like why SignalFire, but then also go really deep if people want to go deep. And that is it that
Yeah.
sort of ability to go high level and deep that makes him even better as a storyteller because he can kind of change what he says per his audience's level of knowledge.
Yeah, yeah. I think he definitely does a really good job of that, which is there are so many details in the model, and every founder is very different in kind of
Yeah.
what they're looking for in a partner and like what their business needs, et cetera. So I think he's really good at kind of like mapping what are the right nuggets that are features of that, the model that he can map directly to the founder and kind of like art, craft sort of a very tailored pitch, if you
How
will.
much prep do you think he does, or talk about yourself too, because you do a lot of this too, I'm sure. When you are trying to pitch let's say an LP to get funding for SignalFire, or you're pitching an entrepreneur because you really want to invest in their fund, or someone you're looking to hire, how much prep work do you do about them so you come into the meeting ready to go, or you're like sometimes like, all right, like I get it. They went to Stanford, CS at Stanford, they went through YC. I can pitch them all day long because I know their story already.
Yeah, yeah. I personally have to. Like somebody like Chris, he is he's also like I think he was a competitive debate guy like in the past. Like he just kind of like figures out how to construct the right argument kind of on the fly, if you
Yeah.
will. I'm not that kind of person, so I have to do my homework. To your point, like if I'm doing a reverse pitch for a founder, to try to win an allocation or an LP pitch, as you mentioned, like I'm generally doing like half an hour of prep beforehand.
Okay.
Like I'm actually building kind of like a little bit of a pitch deck that's
Yep.
tailored for the audience. I'm thinking about like what are the key messages I want to highlight, making sure I've got like the demo. This is one of the cool things about what SignalFire has to offer is I think we're the only venture fund that out there that can do like an hour long kind of reverse pitch with like complete with like a demo of our products, case studies, KPIs, all that kind of stuff. So it's a little bit like I would imagine, an AE, preparing for like a large enterprise sale.
But what shocked me too is I've come across a lot of founders who I'll get on a call, they're trying to pitch me, let's say, for funding. Um, and I've worked with salespeople who actually don't do a lot of that prep work. It's sort of shocking. They're like, oh, like, nice to meet you. Like, where do you live? And I'm like, have you not looked at my LinkedIn? Like, I have yours pulled up right here. Have you not looked at my LinkedIn? Like, that's just like a basic, like, fine, we can shoot the shit for a few minutes about like where I live and why I like San Francisco. But like, that should be a basic thing you already know about me coming into it. And like, I've listed a bunch of the different companies I've invested in, but it's shocking how many people don't do that prep work. And at least for me, that's a turnoff. I don't know. Is that like
Mm-hmm.
an automatic turnoff for you? Or like, do you look for prep? Let's say someone
Yeah.
hasn't prepped about you all that much, but they
Yeah.
know their industry so well. They're like the global leader in their industry. We'd be like, okay, like that's annoying. They didn't do that prep, but it's not a negative signal, or it's like a signal, but like
Yeah.
all the other stuff looks so good, I can ignore this. Or is that just like,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
there's a weird sign here?
Yeah, yeah, I totally, I get the point you're asking. It's hard for me to kind of divine signal from that because it could just be a sign that somebody is super busy and stacking a bunch of meetings through the day, which could be indicative of like a competitive fundraise process, for example,
Mhm.
which in of itself may or may not be a good sign. I think we can debate that, but so I don't know if I read too much into it. I think in general you are looking for people who, I mean, look, you partner with founders. You're signing up for like 10, 15 years. So you hope, you really hope you can find somebody who, who can, who you just kind of vibe with and gel with and
Yep.
can develop a strong partnership. But, that said, I try not to read too much into that as like a first impression and try to kind of like, get to know somebody over the course of a longer arc, if you will. Connect the dots, as they like to say,
Yeah.
over multiple interactions versus like maybe this person just happened to be busy and didn't do any research on me, which is okay. Sometimes that, frankly, like if my day is stacked, I might be showing up to meetings and actually have forgotten like where the intro came from, what
Yeah.
what that specific meeting was, especially if I'm running late after like a series of pitch after pitch.
So you should use it. I'll tell you my system that I do to try to avoid that, which is taking me a long time to
Yeah.
perfect. But I actually have my EA every morning before I start my day. She goes through every single meeting that I have. I have a set list of questions that I want to know about every single person I'm meeting. And she prepares all that stuff for every single person. Like, how did I meet them? Any emails from them, any recent tweets, their LinkedIn profile, all that sort of information, past meetings I've had with them, all of that is already in a single doc that it's a single Google Doc that we just share. And and she cleans it out, I think every like 3 days, rolling 3 days. So if I want to go back to it, I can find it. But otherwise she puts it into our ClickUp in this case for us, where we store all of our data. But like, so every day I come in now, even more so for calls like this, we have a whole other prep sheet that I do with someone else in my team. But yeah, so that's how I make sure that I personally at least try to come to every meeting quasi prepared.
Yeah, super smart. I try to include relevant bits of context in the meeting invite, which is like really where my workflow lives if I'm like just nailing kind of like meeting after meeting. But it's I think your methodology certainly there's going to be a lot more richness to it.
I think so. I hope so. It seems to make for good meetings. But okay, so going back, I want to go back to like Chris's ability to like find talent and like, okay, so great. He wants to hire really smart people who've done diverse things, maybe Olympians, just interesting different skill sets. But even still, once again, there's thousands of Olympians and former Olympians. How does he hone in, or how have you also, when you're hiring, honed in on that extra spark that makes that potential teammate or potential entrepreneur just like that much better? Because like you're only already at your level at SignalFire, you're already only talking to probably the top 10% of entrepreneurs, or even getting through the filters to make it to your doorstep. You still have to filter out all of them. And I don't know how many meetings you have every month with entrepreneurs, but probably hundreds. And you're filtering out to look for, I don't know, but what, I don't even know, the 5-ish a year that you're going to make an investment in, maybe. So how do you still do that? There's still a massive amount of filtering against people who are all top of their class in everything.
Yeah. Maybe I'll add, augment to the point I made. I think one thing we look for in talent is sort of hybrid people who combine very rare skill sets together that make them truly one of one. And I mentioned kind of this point of unrelated. I think it's a really important point to make of like sometimes like peripherally unrelated talents that are actually very valuable in combination. I'll give you an example. I think someone like a Justin Barad also, who is a valedictorian surgeon, trained at Harvard, who also happened to teach himself how to code at age 13 and develop AAA games at EA. Yeah. And he started a VR surgical training suite to address the training gap he saw as a resident. You got to ask yourself how many people kind of like match that background. That's exactly, it can't be many. He might be the only one, really. Or like a Tim Novikov at Perceptron, who was worked with the original Google research team that invented the transformer model and launched Google Photos, but is also a former high school teacher. And he did his PhD in sort of pedagogy teaching, and combined those skills to sort of launch an AI tutor for kids. Yeah. Like how many? It's like very rare. I would say. Yeah. Very possibly like there's only a few people in the world who kind of, and it almost, for people with those backgrounds, it almost feels like their life's work has sort of, led them to this singular moment of creating this specific company. And it also guarantees, I think, this person is, they're going to have sort of an authentic passion about this problem space. And also, I think, not to be underrated, likely has this internal narrative compelling them forward, right, where others would give up, right? If everything has led you to this one point, right, you got to feel like it's your manifest destiny to figure this thing out and make it work. And I think the power of an internal narrative is something that's severely underrated as a driver of persistence in many cases. And
is that internal narrative? Do you find that there is something that is similar to that internal narrative for people? So it's something in their past when they were growing up, right? We were talking about our kids and how they're probably going to grow up in a bubble, things like that. Like maybe they're not going to have that hardship that drives them to go create the next great company, which maybe they don't need to be clear. Like there's lots of paths in life, but we're talking about entrepreneurs and great entrepreneurs here. Do you think there's something that drives this internal narrative of like the truly best people? Like, some hardship, some challenge they faced, some personal anecdote or story that they're like, I need to fix this because I had something major happen in my life.
Yeah. I think it's often the case. It's hard to generalize because there are so many different founder archetypes for people that persist when all others kind of give up, and it's deeply personal, right? So in some cases, I've seen, maybe one of the most common archetypes is founders with sort of a deep chip on their shoulder. Yeah. Maybe a lot of folks like myself, like nerdied bullied in school, or came from a broken household. They've seen that a lot, or whatever it is, and they have this deep-seated desire to win and kind of prove themselves worthy, if you will. And I think this is, it's a pretty common and relatable founder trait. I think a lot of us have some insecurity, but the difference with many of the best founders, I think, is they don't let it be a liability in their lives. They've mastered their psychology to turn it into an asset, right, and do something really transformative for the world. So I'm definitely not going to say you have to be like a broken person, or what have you, to successfully start a company. But I will observe in my experience, a disproportionate percentage of the more successful founders, have had something, happen to them, have faced a lot of adversity, have a noticeable chip on the shoulder, but have figured out ways to kind of rise above it.
Yeah. And do you think that is going back to sort of the idea that, hey, like venture capital and being an entrepreneur, like at least a venture-backed entrepreneur, is sort of like a sexy thing right now? Like, how do you weed that out? Because there's lots and lots of smart people who are coming from, maybe they got laid off from their big tech job where it was nice and comfortable. And they're like, I'm going to go start a company and raise millions of dollars. It's going to cover my salary, things like that. Like, how do you weed those out? Or is it asking about like, why are you really doing this? What is your real passion here? Is it asking those sorts of questions to identify that?
Yeah. I think it's highly unlikely if somebody has sort of Three Sigma persistence or passion that they wouldn't have demonstrated that somehow in their actions, even if not like if generally in life and not in like this like a work context. For example, if like you're very young, I'll give you an example of one of the founders in our portfolio, Moya at Tempo. I mean, who was homeless in high school, put himself through Columbia machine learning degree by being a physical trainer, and then started a company using ML to democratize access to physical training, right? And for the first 5 years of the company, he didn't have any product market fit, while he paid himself like a welfare wage in the Bay, while also supporting his family.
That's
before
crazy.
kind of pivoting to, and it's like, it's, I say that just to be, provocative. It's like a very clear, I guess, example of somebody who's demonstrated persistence, and it just clearly kind of played out over the course of his startup. Before, I think he spent something like $500K of his $1.5 million seed round to launch a consumer hardware product, which eventually got to like tens of millions of revenue, and so forth. And like, I don't think anybody would have survived that long on that little. The company would have shut down a long time ago. So I think that's an extreme example. Not everybody's going to be like homeless, in high school. But I think you should be able to kind of tease out examples of in the past where, where somebody has gone the extra mile.
Yeah. And when do you think through, like, kind of speaking along those lines, right? Let's talk about today's sort of an interesting day. So we're recording this for those who are listening to it in the future. We're recording this on it's sort of a special, interesting day. Obviously, it's September 12th, which one is the day after September 11th, which is its own, somber moment in, I'm sure, really impacted the entire United States, if not the world, in a lot of different ways. But that's sort of number one. But then number two, it's also a day where today, Walter Isaacson's new biography about Elon Musk came out. It's also the Apple launch event for kind of their fall launch event for all their new gear. And when a lot of people, it's basically, go watch their free advertising video about this at some point later. But there's a bunch of entrepreneurs, right? You have Elon Musk, who definitely has a chip on his shoulder, still does, it seems, even though he's the world's richest man. But also kind of, an asshole in a lot of ways. It has that element. You have Steve Jobs, who was clearly changed the world. And was a genius, but also a bit of an asshole to work for. You have people like Jeff Bezos, who was notoriously at least difficult to work for. I don't know if he was an asshole, but just really high standards. I don't know what his chip was. I think Jeff actually grew up in a pretty like healthy, normal life from what I know of his biography. And then you have other folks as well, like Travis Kalanick, right, from Uber, who also was, but all those companies were also changing industries, and they just had to persevere and fight through these industries in some ways. Like, are there certain elements, once again, maybe about the personality, like the asshole founder versus like the nice guy founder, or nice gal, of course, too? Like, are there different personality traits you look for, or maybe you don't even know, because like they may give you the nice picture, and then they're totally different perspective when they're working with their team.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it's something I've it's something I've given some thought. I make an analogy to sports, which I think of as like the ultimate low barrier to entry, requires enormous persistence kind of field, right? Where literally hundreds of millions of people play the same exact game. How do you actually become, the world's best
How do you become like
basketball or tennis player or whatever it is?
Yep.
And I think the archetype, people assumed the archetype had to be Michael Jordan. You have to be just like massive chip on your shoulder, huge asshole, just like you're playing not to lose.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I just cannot stand to lose to anybody else in the world. I have to prove I'm better. But then I see people like, like a Roger Federer or somebody like that,
or Steph Curry to use that
crazy great. Yeah. Just like intensely competitive, but also is like, very obviously like non-asshole, carries himself very well. Yeah. And I have to think like, the optimist in me thinks, if he can do it, it's entrepreneurs can do this too, and not be an asshole. I would say if I look across the portfolio of founders I work with, there are plenty of founders, I would say, who are, like very kind-hearted on the, on maybe like some people might even think of them as mellow personalities, mm-hmm. and have still been enormously successful. I think of like Ben at Pinterest as an example, yeah. or like a Rami, at Even Up. Like I wouldn't call him mellow. He's certainly very intense, but he's a super thoughtful, sweet guy. Yeah. And he runs his business like a killer.
Well, and that's actually sort of my question then too, because like this is actually something, by the way, like for myself as an entrepreneur, I struggle with sometimes. I'm like, man, maybe I'm too nice sometimes, and maybe it's not like you can treat people nicely, but maybe I'm not willing to make the really hard decision that's going to piss someone off, and I worry about that with myself and maybe a lot of other entrepreneurs. So how do you become that entrepreneur? Look, you can be a nice person, but make the tough calls and just like, this is the decision we're making. We're going forward. Like, let's move on. What is that sort of killer instinct to just to make the decision and move on forward with it, even though it's going to piss people off or hurt people in your company or might lead to layoffs or whatever it takes to like keep the company moving forward?
Yeah. I think true compassion in some ways is doing the hard but right things.
I love that's a great way to put it.
And I think but you obviously have to be sensitive, very sensitive, and kind of like the second order effects. I think that's maybe the piece that Elon Musk and others fall down on. It's like there's all sorts of collateral damage to like these very sudden decisions that.
Yes, and Elon clearly doesn't care. Elon doesn't care at all about the collateral damage.
Yeah. So maybe that's the piece that is sometimes missing here. But I think it is tricky, especially a lot of first-time founders. I would say have a tendency to be try not to piss as many people off.
Yeah.
But you're right. Like it's doing nobody any favors if you're making decisions that are going to be like short term, easier for people to handle, but like long term in the detriment to the company, and ultimately, the employees and shareholders. And
is there a level of charisma? I mean, going back to your point about the discussion we were having about Chris, is there though a level of charisma that some of the best founders still have, right? So to your point about like you want to hire people that have this following, right? Even though everyone clearly knows like, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Steve Jobs had these negative personality traits. A lot of people would follow them to the end of the earth. And frankly, like if one of them called me up today and says, Adam, do you want to come work for me? I probably would say, fuck yeah, sign me up. I know it's going to be hell, but man, I want to go work at the highest levels and test myself against that every day, because they do that, even knowing their personality. But they must have that sort of personality trait or charisma or something that's led them to have this following. Like people will follow them to the end of the earth, some of these folks.
Yeah. I haven't worked personally with Elon, so I don't know. It's so hard to know like what the gap between kind of like public perception, the actions that we're seeing as outsiders, and what it's actually like to work with these people day to day. I would say, one of the things that I learned at McKinsey that kind of carried over to the startup world, and like there's a lot of things that are diametrically opposed, but one of the things that I saw that's sort of a commonality across leadership is the ability to deliver tough messages in an inspiring, compassionate way.
Mm.
And I think it's one of the it may be like the most difficult leadership challenge I know of, to kind of like really thread that needle. And I've seen fantastic fantastic people get this done in Fortune 500 companies and startups.
What are some examples of where that's worked really well, or you've seen people do that, threading that needle extremely well, at least in public ways that you can talk about, of course, but are there some examples?
Yeah, I would say, look, over the last 2 years, there's sort of been a collapse in SaaS, right? So I think there's been like an entire segment of companies and consumer and a whole bunch of other, high growth categories. So I think there's been an entire, entire swath of startup leaders that have had to figure out, ways to kind of handle this internally. And, I think one of the best ways I've heard, approaches I've heard from a founder was, he told me he basically used this as an opportunity to rehire the entire company. By which I mean go through everybody at the company, get them super jazzed about what the future of the business, in the same way that you would be closing a candidate, right? Like going to their house, even if they're an employee, doing lunches with them, going to their house, etc. But also making it clear that the future of the business is going to require, a very different set, of actions and capabilities, and saying like, hey, if this is not for you, I totally understand, right? It's maybe not necessarily what you signed up for. And I think that process had the effect of, there were maybe, I think maybe like 5%, of people left because of that. But the people who remained were sort of much more deeply aligned, with the future of the business. Anyway, so I think that was one of the best ways I've heard. I've heard this approach kind of described to kind of get exactly at that problem.
So it's really sort of to take the compassionate approach, get closer to the people you're with, and take the time. I think one of the challenges I see with a lot of folks, myself included, sometimes is it's too easy to prioritize lots of other things and not spend the time with your team that you need to. I mean, I think recently I spent a lot of time with my team. I actually don't see a lot of my emails, unfortunately. It's a different issue, but I think a lot of founders don't always spend that time, right? It's easier to sometimes go talk to customers or not deal with the people component, or maybe you just don't have experience doing it, right? There's a lot of founders and entrepreneurs who they might be, once again, that this world's combination of the N of one that doesn't exist anywhere else, but maybe they've never managed anybody before. Like that's a whole new skill set. Like how do you figure that out as a founder and understand what it means to be a manager? Because suddenly you have a team of people who might be a lot older than you too, who are now reporting to you. What do the best entrepreneurs do in those scenarios?
Yeah, you're right in that, like all of the successful companies, your founders, first-time founders in particular, are going to have to go through this transition of being 0 to 1 innovators, to being leaders and managers, and it's like night and day what you do.
Do you guys help at SignalFire? Do you help them figure out that transition and learn how to do that properly?
That is one of the power alleys, I think, of SignalFire, is we've got so many people who've made that shift. And I don't mean just like, former founder, but also people like, I think of like a Tawny Krantz at SignalFire, who's the ex-chief talent officer from Netflix.
Yeah.
So one of the authors of the famous culture deck, and kind of like, saw this at the very early days, with Reed, there, or, Heather, Doche, who's we brought her in. She was the head of talent from Webflow. I think she grew Webflow from 40 to 500 people in 2 years. I think so. People who are kind of deep domain experts, in exactly that field, and have kind of seen this longitudinally across many different companies, many different founders, given that this is what they do. So that is, I think for sure, it's I think a really underappreciated kind of pivot point, in a company where a lot of, especially first-time founders, kind of fall flat.
Yeah, we actually joke at one of our sort of kind of keywords or statements we make at Levy is when you hire Levy, but that's when you like move from being a founder to CEO, because it's actually the ability of a founder to let go of things and say, you know what, I don't need to do every task myself. I need to prioritize the highest value ones. And of course, back office is not a high priority item for founders. It shouldn't be. You need to get it done, but it's not a high priority one. But the key point though there is, I think the best founders are the ones who can radically remove things off their plate and continuously change themselves too. Say, look, now is I need to start learning I need to go deep on our product today. Next week, I need to go deep on customers. and be
Mhm.
really focused and go do those things. Are those the sort of things you think are great for founders? Or, I mean, on the flip side, maybe that's too much SOS, shiny object syndrome, and the founders that aren't successful jump around too much.
I think no, many of the best founders do have that um, level of focus, I would say, and I would say they have a really good ability to shorten sort of the cycle time of that, which is to say, okay, my focus for this week is like is like closing these two hires,
Yeah.
or it's my focus for the next 2 weeks is really kind of figuring out a specific element of the go-to-market motion or what have you. And I think a lot of the best founders I've worked with have a very clear perspective. I'm kind of like, what is the top fire to kind of put out, and what smaller fires, make sense to kind of let burn, and go out and really kind of go all out to fix those immediately. You know, so
Is
yeah.
is there a percentage of time that founders should be spending on certain tasks? Like, I mean, maybe it changes at its stage, or maybe there is no rule of thumb, but like, hey, you should be spending 50% of your time on recruiting and hiring if you're in growth mode. Um, or then 25% on product and 25% on sales and marketing, and everything else doesn't matter. Are there like rules of thumb that you guys look for or recommend?
No, I don't think there's a general rule because every founder is going to have sort of a different set of capabilities,
Yeah.
responsibilities for within kind of the organizational context. So I think, but that said, uh, I think a lot of founders, when they're starting to hit hyperscale, underestimate what percentage of time they really should be spending on recruiting. Sometimes it's like 75%, sometimes it's like near 100%. Um, uh, and I think a lot of founders also maybe underinvest in the early days on before that point on the talent and recruiting foundation it
Mm.
requires to scale up. As it relates to your your interviewing playbook, right? Your thinking through your candidate experience, your onboarding, all those sorts of things. Making sure you kind of eat your vegetables, if you will, early, so that you
Yeah.
can run
Get
faster
healthy and
later.
strong
You know,
and ready. Yep. Do you think people should be spending time? This is going to another thing that's just minor pet peeve of mine, but like, how much time for early founders should they be spending on marketing and preparing for that even before they like have product market fit, but like building up a name for themselves? Or should they wait until they have product market fit and then start marketing and sales?
yeah. It depends on like what audience and what you stand to gain from it.
Mm,
I think there are some startups, for example, who in the very early days can kind of just like pull from their own networks because there was like a Twitter mafia or whatever
yeah.
that they could just like draw from. At some point, that doesn't scale, and you're going to have to do some of the things you're mentioning. But maybe they can kind of really they're just focusing on hiring known quantities
Hmm.
in the early days, and therefore there's not as much of an impetus from a recruiting objective to be more public. So I think it's really depends from company to company. There's also some companies where having more of an external brand has a knock-on halo effect for closing customers, because they'll just like, maybe these are like super large Fortune 500 companies in a certain area where um, reputation is really important, and they need to be able to like look you up and see
Yeah.
you have like press releases and you're cited by repeat. Like I've been surprised in some cases, how that's opened doors for some of our companies. So I think it really depends. But I do think there's no kind of blanket, and I think you have to be very precise on like, what is the objective I'm looking to solve by being more public.
Yeah,
And there's
that's
certainly
great.
downsides too. There's certainly downsides to doing it.
What are the what are
Every
the
time.
downsides?
Yeah, I mean, it invites competition on some level. I remember there's this is maybe a little bit more later stage, but there's an example of a company that you and I invested in that released a press release, and suddenly an incumbent decided to launch a competitive product the next week.
Yep.
So that stuff happens for sure, and especially in the age of like where you've got so many different founders who are potential founders who are leaving these
Yeah.
these academy companies. Looking for like their next latest and greatest idea. You're bound to like see 4 YC clones in the next batch.
Yeah.
If the company is very successful.
How much then should founders be? I mean, this is something that what do you tell the best founders, like, or what do the best founders do that you work with about competition? Should they care? Do they pay attention to competition? Does it matter? Or they're just like, just go execute.
Yeah. I think in general, many of the best founders I work with have like low level paranoia, is what I would call it.
Yeah.
Use it as an impetus to continue kind of moving fast and staying, one or two laps ahead. But recognizing that in just about all cases, it's sort of your race to lose.
Yeah.
If you're the one who's building the category. So I think there's a tightrope to walk there, and it's certainly a spectrum, right? There's some industries that are just inherently like more competitive, where there's less barriers to entry, and there's some where the model itself is very difficult to crack, maybe because there's like a chicken egg problem. But once you solve it and getting to the other side, the business is much more defensible. So certainly I think their varying companies have different strategic imperatives, to really obsess about competition versus not. But I think universally, I think a lot of the best founders kind of have this low level paranoia and use it to kind of motivate their speed.
So on that note, speed's a great question that I want to ask about too, which is like, how do you measure speed as a founder? Like, what do the great founders do to measure speed and make sure they're moving fast enough without going too fast and breaking things, right? Because the analogy that I think a lot of founders have is like, you're building your company while you're building the car while you're driving down the highway at 80 miles an hour, and you haven't even built brakes, you haven't built basically doors, anything, and you're trying to do all that at once. But at some point it's too fast. Maybe you don't even have the steering wheel yet, and you're going to go right off the road. So like, what is that measurement? Because like, I know as an entrepreneur, I'm always scared we're not going fast enough. But I also know that I don't want to burn out my team. I don't want to destroy the stuff we are trying to build, and recognize that sometimes if we go too fast, we're not going to build it the right way, and we're going to have to go back and fix all that debt we created by going too fast. Is there a right speed limit for a founder?
A couple principles here, I would say. One is if I can, certainly at the board level as an investor, I think you can tell if every month or every quarter during a board meeting, you're finding you're talking about the same issues, right? The same questions over and over, right? And it just feels like you're knocking your head against, just sort of not making progress. I think that's a very, it's a clear indication on kind of the speed, the speed of execution and learning.
So what do you tell those founders if that's the case before you fire them or something? Like, what do you tell them? Like you need to change up your cadence. Like, they probably know that, but something's broken. Like, how do you help them figure out what's broken in their speed and their cadence because those same things are repeating? Sometimes
it can be tricky to diagnose exactly what the root cause is, right? So it could be, to your point, something in kind of the feedback loop that the founders have built, or it could be something structural in the business itself. And there's a little bit of judgment call trying to figuring out, is this just like a very, an interminable market, right, to sell into, or is this the case that like we're just falling down on shipping product, right, and the product is just like not delivering on what we're promising. So I think you kind of have to, it's a little bit hard, frankly, at the board level to kind of to get your hands dirty enough, just from like if you're just showing up to quarterly board meetings. I think you really do have to like get your hands a little bit dirty and speak to customers, talk to the team. I think this is where in many cases it's helpful to have an independent on the board who is an operator themselves, kind of like been through this before and potentially has like a deeper relationship, a working relationship with the broader team, across the company, where maybe they're, they may even be on site, for a day or two every week, work,
like
helping,
really,
as a coach, right? Helping the executive team, and those sorts of folks, I think will have a better chance of being diagnosed. Is this organizational capability issue, or is this like, wrong product, wrong market?
Yeah. Do you guys at SignalFire? So I'm guessing like you guys have had, probably 70 to 90% of the companies you back, despite all the great metrics you've set up and ways you try to track this, probably 70 to 90% of those companies still fail, despite investing in the end of one founder, things like that. Do you guys, two questions. One, do you do kind of retros and like why that investment didn't work? And then two, what are some traditional things you've seen for things that you've seen founders or companies fail at, where you're like, man, if only we could have told them that beforehand, they could have avoided it, and maybe the outcome would have been better for everyone involved.
Yeah, I'd say by far the most common reason, especially seed stage company, if you're talking about like 70%
Yeah.
plus failure rates, we're really talking about seed stage companies
Yep. Sure.
in many cases. And those are, I would say by far the most common failure mode is not, not finding product market fit. I think there's maybe a secondary piece that has been not as widely um, publicized, which is founder breakups.
Huge
I think
one.
that it's actually a very, founder divorces is actually a very common cause of like more earlier stage,
Yep.
kind of like inception phase, I would say early, it's starting to kind of like kick off, so that's actually a very common cause. I think in many cases um, by the time, founders have gone through maybe like a, pre-seed phase, maybe they like ship some product, they've maybe worked through a few of those kinks, and then they raise a seed round,
Yep.
I think you kind of weed out maybe some of that in advance. But for sure, I think that's probably another underrated cause of failure that people don't talk as
Before we
widely.
talk about the others, I want to pause on that one for a second. How do you help, or how do you judge, right? Okay, fine. You found this amazing founder who's an N of one. You love their co-founder who's the N of two or whatever, right? There's maybe two of these two special really people in the world. They seem perfect. And of course they give you a good pitch about why they're fantastic and work really well together. Yet still they have a breakup. Are there things you would tell them if you could, or tell companies nowadays, like, hey, this is stuff you're going to see with your co-founder. Avoid a breakup because it's going to be a loss of value for everybody. What do you suggest people do there? Because it is a huge one that people don't talk about a ton. It's so time consuming. It's so expensive, and it can lead to a lot of. It can lead one. Sometimes it can lead to really good chips in the shoulder. One of my best investments, the guy had a founder breakup. He didn't get the company. The company ended up failing, but he had a huge chip in his shoulder. I invested in the next one. It's been a massive success. So it can lead to upside in some cases, but it wasn't great for the investors in the first company because they lost their money. So what, and of course that co-founder didn't work out well for him either. What advice do you have for founders when it comes to founder relationships, because it's so critical?
I feel like this is bordering on like dating advice or marriage advice.
It kind of is.
But it's I think it's very similar.
You're creating a baby, so it basically is dating advice. It's basically marriage advice because your baby is your startup, and the two parents are the co-founder. So yeah, it is dating and marriage advice.
Yeah, that's right. And so I think it's important to there's just like so many dimensions that I think it's helpful to align on, in advance. And I think there's also no substitute for, for actually taking the dating process, like treating it as a process as opposed to like a shotgun marriage, which is like, okay, well, I have a company idea. I need a CTO. Like let's make this happen. You seem like a good, let's make this happen kind of thing.
Yep.
I think, some of the most thoughtful folks, either in many cases, and maybe even most cases for the seed companies we back, there's sort of a history between the co-founders of them actually working together, if not in a startup venture, in, kind of a work context, shipping product at, oftentimes it's like, head of engineering, head of product, et cetera, that successfully shipped product at like a Stripe or what have you. But in the case that they had just met, I think the risk is a lot higher. And I do think it's important to figure out, okay, by what's the level of alignment that you've kind of driven with this co-founder on, how you define success? What is your ultimate vision for the company? Does that align? What's your working styles? What is, how do you, like, what are you looking for in talent? A lot of the questions you're asking me, I think it's helpful to see, try to see if people are kind of on the same page, finishing each other's sentences there, or if they're having, kind of like founder disagreements or, like in public kind of thing.
Yeah, and you can tell that when people are pitching, when they're pitching together, you can tell. I try to advise actually most of my startups. I'm like, look, I don't care which one of you wants to be the one talking most. Don't cut each other off, and if you're finishing each other's sentences, it's like a beautiful thing that's pretty rare, I would imagine. It's more like if one person gives the point and then the other person jumps in and sort of says the same thing, but in a slightly different way. I'm like, yeah, are you guys jiving the right way? That's not a good, even if you're having issues, in the bedroom, don't bring it out to the public sort of thing.
Yeah. You know, if there are issues in public, if like if a couple's quarreling in public, there's probably it's probably worse.
More going on elsewhere. So okay, so keep going. So like, what are the other things? So those are two of the things. What are the other areas where you're like, these are lessons learned where we think it really trips up founders and is a potential driver of failure?
Yeah, I think one that I see quite a lot is sort of this is not running towards the fire,
Mm,
right? I think a lot of it's very human to, especially if you're a first time founder, right? And you've got, like I mentioned, like many people who propel themselves to greatness are doing so with a chip on their shoulder, but maybe the insecurity also manifests in not wanting to admit mistakes, right? As an unproven first time founder, et cetera,
yep.
right? And I think that that leads a lot of founders to so many different ways you can say this, but like hide the peanut, run from the fire, et
Yeah.
cetera. And it's not necessarily intentionally misleading. It's just more like a natural inclination to think to 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 be optimistic, like very optimistic about how things are going, which in itself is sort of like a very important founder trait, but I think can backfire in the context of business building day to day, because inevitably there are going to be fires. In some ways, the only thing that matters is how fast you recognize and learn from and put out those fires. And so I think it's in many ways it goes against human instinct, but a huge predictor of founder success.
In how, but some of the best founders then must be really good at identifying, right? We talked earlier about like prioritization and knowing what to focus on. So they
Yeah,
also must be really good at being able to say, okay, like there's this fire here, but this fire is bigger. I'm going to run towards the bigger fire instead of avoiding it in these small. It may be a personal example right now, right? I could be having this conversation with you, or I could be kind of ignoring you and not doing a good job. Hopefully, I'm doing an okay job here, but like in ignoring you and dealing with all the small little fires that are in Slack, which is over here on my screen over here. But right now, my focus is here. I'm personally learning, and this is great. I love this, but like for a lot of people, they just want to, I'm going to go do all my emails and do all my Slack and get to inbox zero because it feels like all these small little things I'm doing a good job on, but maybe ignoring the far bigger value and important thing you're focusing on. But how does a
yeah,
good entrepreneur identify between those two? Because there probably are fires burning over here that I don't know about right now, and I have to get back to them at some point. But like, how do good entrepreneurs and the best ones figure that out, and where to prioritize, what to focus on, what fire is bigger than the other?
yeah. I think you're right that so I'm calling out sort of human nature as driving a lot of maybe running from the fire, but I think you're right that another driver of this is sort of clarity of intent and purpose within your
Mm-hmm.
organization. And obviously it's a lot easier if you're like a repeat founder and you've sort of seen a lot of the mistakes being made. Um, but this is where I think balancing out sort of your um, your resolution and determination with coachability if you're a first time founder, I think is really critical. And I think it's a really tight rope to walk, which is you recognize your only weakness is you can conquer the world. Your only weakness is you haven't done this before. And so being willing to to admit that you don't know something, or you made a mistake, and get some coaching from from world class folks like the folks I mentioned on the talent side, or
Yeah, you guys have such
et cetera,
amazing
is
stable.
you know
So
I think that's yeah.
going actually right along those points, right? So almost bringing it back to where we started, right? Talk about your career. Um, did you do something that I've seen a lot of people do actually when you were thinking, I want to go into VC? And we're bringing this back to the exact point we were talking about, but like when you wanted to go into VC, how much kind of research and learning did you do about the space? Like, did you call up different VCs? Did you start learning about the space overall to build that knowledge base? When you're a wannabe first time venture capitalist, what learning and education did you do for yourself to kind of prepare for that path and even decide if that was the right path to take, which then let you prioritize and make certain decisions and leave Kleiner, then go to Google, then go to General Cat or SignalFire, like those sorts of things. Like, what sort of research or knowledge did you build out to go do that early on?
Yeah, yeah. The early process for me was very much at the time, like I mentioned, there's just like there are no jobs in venture capital. Nobody's like putting up job postings, you might have like one or two people hired into the entire industry in a given year. So really, I was my goal is like, how can I break in just to see what it's like?
Yeah.
Because I had hypotheses on why it would be a good fit. I'm like fairly ADD. I like learning about different things, and so it felt like a really, as opposed to like going really deep. So it felt like it was potentially a good fit from that side. I really liked the startup journey, on a deeply personal level, as I mentioned. So I really kind of wanted to empower entrepreneurs. So there were a bunch of different reasons why I was attracted to the job. I just had to figure out a way to be able to, really just trial this thing. And, for me, it was thinking about myself as sort of, micro entrepreneur, and thinking about like, okay, what are the tests and experiments that I can run to figure out if I can add unique value in kind of the ways that matter for VC, which is, picking companies, identifying who's going to be the winner, helping support companies winning allocation, right? You have to, I think these are things that one can do in various forms without being at a VC fund. And it just so happened that, one of the unique pieces of my background is I spent time at MGI, McKinsey Global Institute, think tank arm, and I had done a bunch of research on the future of energy demand way back in the day. Kleiner, when I joined, this is in 2012 or so, was doing a lot of sustainability investing. And when they were doing so, there's a large macro component to many of the theses that they're underwriting. So, for example, if you're investing in like natural gas vehicles, you have to have a macro thesis of what is the spread on energy prices between NGL and petro, for example, right? And so I kind of use that as a wedge, and sent that report that I'd helped author to some of the folks at Kleiner, and thankfully they gave me a chance. Another experiment I ran was I also spent some time strangely as a school system administrator back in the day as well,
and like the IT administrator, basically.
No, I actually followed one of my McKinsey partners to CCC. CPS is like the post-secondary arm, open access institutions in Chicago. He had joined. At the time, like Rahm Emanuel had just been elected the mayor, and he was like turning over the leadership and installing kind of like new folks. And so I followed him in sort of a turnaround effort for these institutions, if you will. And I noticed that like Bessemer had and a bunch of other, they had made a lot of like post-secondary ed tech investments, but they hadn't done a lot in K through 12. And so I volunteered to basically just like do a project for free, in the K through 12 space for Bessemer, like mapping it, for the partner who had made some investments there. So I think there are various kind of experiments you can run to kind of like get your foot in the door. And if you can certainly architect kind of like no-brainer, hard to say no value propositions for like busy VCs who are just they're all looking for an edge in picking like picking winning deals. And so if you kind of like build something that's of value right along one of those dimensions, I think that was really kind of the approach. And I think as a general principle, it's helpful to think about like what are the things that you can sort of what are things just like a micro entrepreneur. What are the things that you can test and iterate and learn from really quickly as you try to figure that out?
And it's really about, to go back to one of the comments you made really early on, it's about kind of raising your hand in generating value without necessarily any expectation of a return, right? Yes, if you create great value and raise your hand and say, I'm going to jump up and do that, you will get a return of some sort for it. It's funny. I laughed when you said it earlier because it's something we talked about at my team just on Monday. We had a conversation about that. It's like, look, raise your hand. If you want to be in the mix, if you want to be part of these discussions and be strategic, you need to raise your hand. No one's just going to hand it to you. So is that one of the things that you talk about? Like, do you see these entrepreneurs who are the best ones? They will just keep raising their hand in a sense, even if it's just for their company. I'm going to go raise my hand. I'm going to go tackle that. If you're not going to go do it, I'm going to go tackle it. Is it that sort of mentality that you kind of look for? I'm always an entrepreneur. It's never going to leave my body. I'm just going to keep fighting and taking on this new topic. Is there something about, again, it's not like you did that for your career. It sounds like a lot of the entrepreneurs do. What does that look like? Is that maybe just creating a great product, or is that creating an amazing, perfectly timed pitch to Wayne and saying, hey, Wayne, like I know you talk about this on your YouTube channel. You talk about this. Here's my thesis on this. Would love to chat with you more about my job startup because you talk all about XYZ. Like, is it that sort of stuff? Like, And here's some research. Like, is that sort of the value generation that you sometimes see that like gives an edge to the best entrepreneurs?
Yeah, I think you're right that a lot of the best entrepreneurs, they can't help themselves
Yeah.
in raising their hands, and and it manifests in so many different areas of their lives, like starting a podcast, a YouTube channel kind of thing. It's just like you can't help it in some ways, to try to try new things and launch and try to create value. So I think that's it just sort of seeps from the pores of like all the best entrepreneurs I've met. Um, and certainly, yeah, in the context of founders reaching out to me, I think it's rare to find something that's like a really targeted outreach. But when it happens, I certainly really appreciate
Yeah.
the level of thought and and kind of raising your hand, to your point, but raising your hand in kind of like in a very thoughtful, targeted way.
And what about that tenacity too, right? So speaking, going back to targeted parts, but like tenacity. I mean, how many of the entrepreneurs you've worked with or done deals with have sent you an email, reached out to you on Twitter, commented on your YouTube videos, reached out to you on LinkedIn, it found you in different ways? Like, have you seen that happen very often? And if you have, or even if it not often, but when it has happened, have those been some of your better investments because that shows a level of tenacity and interest? Say like, I want Wayne at my cap table.
Yeah. Yeah. I am, I'm gonna be honest. I don't think my public profile is sort of big enough at this stage where, that represents sort of like a big part of my deal flow. I would say in general, I'm usually the one who's pitching myself to kind of like get on the cap table of amazing founders. I certainly, I am an endless optimist. I believe, I sort of believe, there's a lot of people that could be very successful entrepreneurs, a little bit like, aligned with your mission. So I'm hopeful that that's the case. I think it's probably more a function of me, not quite, having matured kind of the social media, because I'm sure that happens for, many of the iconic VCs out there.
But it also, I think, goes to show where this is where maybe a lot of entrepreneurs fall down, or at least if they're looking for venture funding, where there are the large majority of VCs don't have major public presences. And like, if you want, I mean, I talk to lots of early stage founders and they're like, well, I need to find funding. I need to find the right VC. And I'm like, how many of them have you really reached out to? How much real research have you done on the ones who are the perfect target for you? Like, what are you really doing to have that tenacity? I mean, the worst question I get from people is when like, hey, I'm in this space. Can you make some intros to VCs who love to invest in this space? I'm like, no. First of all, like, I don't have that list necessarily in my head. But second of all, no, go do your own research. We're connected on LinkedIn. You can figure out who I'm connected to. Give me a list of the top 10 people you want to talk to. Here's the outline of like the short blurb you want me to forward on, all those sorts of things. And so many people just don't take that extra effort, which is already a huge negative signal for me, at least, in helping them out. So
Yeah.
Along those lines a little bit then, to some extent, is where I know we're getting close on time actually, is what are the key, if there's like one thing to break it down with like entrepreneurs, like what is the one core thing that you would tell every single entrepreneur that like, this is, if there's one quality they had or one skill set they got good at, what would that one thing be? Work on X and you have a higher chance at success. It still doesn't guarantee anything. You have a higher chance at success.
Yeah. I think, I'll reiterate, run towards the fire.
Yeah.
Right. I think embrace things that aren't working head on. Right. Failure is inevitable in building startups. And in fact, arguably the only thing that matters for early stage startups is how fast you fail and the quality of your learnings. And, as I mentioned, I see so many, especially first time founders who are afraid to kind of confront, the failure, like the micro failures, even on a day-to-day basis. And that's human, but I think also the opposite, of what you need to do at a startup.
So just to ask then, what is it? Where does the name SignalFire come from? Is that just a thesis everyone has about running towards the fire? You're looking for the signal in the fire. Like, I know you didn't mean it that way, but like, I was like, okay, well, what does the name SignalFire mean? Is it about looking for that signal or that fire and finding the one you need to put out? Maybe.
It's actually the name of, are you like, have you seen like Lord of the Rings?
Of course.
Are you a Tolkien nerd? Okay. So that scene in the movie where they have to like alert, the native, the right. With
fire
on the top of the mountain.
Yep.
That actually has some grounding in real history, and it's called the SignalFire.
Yep.
And so part of the origin of the name is very much sort of kind of like acting as that beacon,
Mm-hmm.
right? Uh, for I think it takes various contexts in using data, right? It's for our internal team, it's finding kind of lighthouse founders,
Yep.
right, very early on as they're starting companies. For our companies, it's finding amazing talent that's hyper specialized to the stage and what they're looking for. In the wilderness of of startup building, can you provide sort of that signal kind of in the night?
I love that, which is so hard because for every founder, you're starting something brand new. You're doing the best companies are the ones who've done something that no one's done before, and it's really
Mm-hmm.
hard to do. So it has to be that signal, bright light, optimistic that the world can change and create something better. So on that note, how can people get the signal to you, Wayne? How can people find you? How can they reach out? How can they get in touch if they want to talk with you and learn more? And have you on their cap table, which honestly, like after this whole conversation, if we were fundraising, I'd be like, I want Wayne in my cap table. Like this is like learn so much and you're so thoughtful about these things. How can all the best N of one founders find you and get in touch?
Yeah, I would say by doing a lot of things that you mentioned, right? If I don't I'm not super active on Twitter and social media and so forth, but if folks find a way to get in touch and do so in very thoughtful ways and can share some of the dimensions that we talked about that really are great predictors for incredible startup success. Whether it's part of their personal journey or kind of a unique insight on like a massive market that is fast moving. I think that's probably the best way. And I know it sounds vague, deliberately so, because in many ways, getting in touch with the right VCs and standing up from the crowd is in some ways kind of a microcosm of the entrepreneur journey, right? And I think you have to figure out ways to, if you can't do that well, it's unlikely that you're going to do the impossible, which is build an iconic startup business.
I think super well said and so true, right? It really is. It's almost reiterate the point, but I totally agree that so many of these skill sets that the best entrepreneurs have are essentially repeated in all just different facets, right? Telling a great story is how you recruit great people to your team, but it's also how you convince great VCs to put money in and back you with not only their money, but of course, time. It's how you convince your customers to buy a product that's really early stage and probably is going to break on them and maybe could lose them their job, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
they're going to take a risk on your product because you told them a great story. Those sorts of things and being just tenacious and going about it and maybe be like, hey, where does Wayne live? I'm going to go pretend that I'm at the coffee shop down the street from you and be like, oh, let's meet up for a coffee. Things like that it really is such a great point. So for all the folks out there, if you want to get Wayne involved, go be tenacious, go find him, get involved, work hard, showcase that you are the type of founder that is going to move mountains, change the world in an optimistic and positive way. So Wayne, thank you so much for joining me on this call today. I really, really appreciate it. I learned a ton, so thank you.